Hey everybody in the VC, it's Matt, and hope you're having a good weekend. And I'm just racing through these Rolling Stone albums review. It's been, man, it's only been a mere 3 months or so since the last one. So, but in my defense, I've been lazy lately, obviously. But here I am back, and we're at 1968, and we are up to Beggar's Banquet, which came out on pretty late in the year. Came out December 6th of 1968. Got to number 5 in the United States and then to number 3 over in England. This is a reissue, mono copy. Obviously, this is the cover that the band wanted to have originally, but the record company said, "Oh no, we can't have that. This is probably considered a little bit racy in 1968." The album cover, and that's one of the reasons why the album came out later in the year, because the band and their label were going back and forth fighting over whether they could have this cover or not, and so that pushed the album's release back a little bit. What we ended up getting in 68 was almost a plain white sleeve, kind of like the White Album, released this same year, just a month earlier, but had kind of like an invitation. It had script writing, said the Rolling Stones Beggar's Banquet, with an RSVP down at the bottom, kind of an invitation for the listener to join the Rolling Stones and partake in their Beggar's Banquet. And this cover, there's the back, and the gatefold on both the released version in 68 and this one that came out several years later finally, gatefold is the same. This is okay cover, I guess. I was never that crazy about it. I actually prefer the invitation, the script cover. Might be because it's the one that I knew the longest or that I grew up with. I had a copy of that on vinyl and I can't seem to find it now. I thought I had a copy on CD too, but even my CD copy is the bathroom toilet cover. This is kind of fun to read the stuff on here, but I do kind of like the simplicity of just the white invitation cover. But this is the way the band intended it to be originally, so I guess it's good that it finally did come out that way. So a lot of people rate this as their best album, or up there with their best album, in the top, 3 or 4 or 5. I certainly can't argue with that. My favorite personally is Between the Buttons, but this is probably number 2 or 3 for me. And this was also by many seen as a return to form, back to their basic rock and roll and blues roots after the detour into psychedelia with Satanic Majesty's Request and their all their stuff that they were doing in 1967, and even Between the Buttons to some degree. This is helped along by the single Jumping Jack Flash, which came out in May of 68, which was seen as a kind of return to the rock and roll, the sort of last time satisfaction type rock and roll the Rolling Stones were known for and got famous for. Huge hit, number 1 everywhere, one of their most enduring songs, a great song. The flip side, Child of the Moon, which is equally great song, is probably their last dip into psychedelic music. I think there's something on one of their 90s albums, I can't remember the name of the song, that's slightly psychedelic, but at that point it was probably just doing it for fun. But Child of the Moon was sort of their last foray into that genre, and you're not going to find any psychedelia on this album really at all. So this also, to me, always seemed like it's kind of their first grown-up album. Like they're not really kids anymore. There is a return to the blues, but it's a different type of blues from the stuff that they were making earlier on their 64, 65, 66 albums. That stuff was great too. This is a more sort of dirtier, more raw, down home, more sinister blues, seems like to me. This is also the first album that Jimmy Miller produced, and he produced their next, I believe, 5 albums. I think he produced everything through Goat's Head Soup. I know he produced Exile on Main Street. I'm pretty sure he did Goat's Head 2. But that sort of brought a new shine, a new change to their sound. And this 4 album run from this through Exile are considered by many to be their finest run, their finest moment. It's also about this time, roughly about this time, that they started calling themselves the greatest rock and roll band ever or of all time. This is also, sadly, kind of a closing chapter for the band, even though more so with the next album, Let It Bleed. But this is pretty much Brian Jones's last stand with the band. He does contribute on this. There's a couple of, he plays on pretty much all the songs. There's a couple of them that he doesn't. But his influence and his presence is greatly diminishing, and he would play on 2 or 3 songs on Let It Bleed, but that album actually came out a few days after he died. But on here, he's got a couple of shining moments, but sadly, for the most part, he's here, but just here in body only. He also was not present for a lot of these sessions and was just sort of out of it, and unfortunately, a very sad case and a sad ending to a complicated and very talented person. So, like I said, the blues here is a little more grown up, a little more edgy, a little more lived in at this point. They don't seem like just kids who love the blues and are trying to sing blues songs. They seem like they have sort of experienced and lived the tenets of the songs at this point, to some degree anyway, as much as multimillionaire 20-something pop stars can do that. But they do seem pretty genuine in their takes on this. It's also, besides rock and blues, you get a lot of variety, sort of world music stuff. You get a lot of samba and Latin beat. You get a lot of African and Middle Eastern music influences on this album. So yeah, let's just get into the songs. The first song, side 1, Sympathy for the Devil. All the songs on this album, of course, are written by Mick and Keith, with the exception of one cover song. So Sympathy is based loosely on the novel The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, I think is how you say his last name, a Russian author. Book that he wrote from the 20s to the 40s, but it didn't come out till after his death. It came out around 65, 66, a book that Mick and maybe Keith too had read. It's kind of a tour de force. It's very one of their best album openers. It's got a samba beat. It's just danceable. It's very bouncy, dancing groove. It just cooks the whole song. It's got some stinging guitar solos from Keith, and got those whoo background vocals throughout the whole song. That great bass line, which is actually played by Keith, not Bill. And that was the story of the devil and his meddling or participation in history. And he shows up with the tempting of Jesus, shows up with the wars of England and France and Europe back in the Middle Ages, and with the Russian Revolution and the Romanov slaughter, death of the Kennedys, and just sort of from that his perspective of that, and his blame there, and Mick sort of turning the blame towards all of us in the song. It's just a great song, great opener. The topic of the song aside, it's a great rocker. and a great dance song, and it just grooves and bounces along and cooks. Like I said, I give it a 10. There is a movie about this song, sort of kind of Jean-Luc Godard movie called One on One, which shows, which is kind of interesting because you get to see Brian Jones, sadly towards the end of his life, and a very run-down and defeated Brian Jones. But you get to see the rest of the band working on this song, which sort of started off as a simpler acoustic folk song, and then Keith sort of suggested, you know, that you pick up the beat, pick up the pace, and that it became the sort of runaway train song that it is. But the movie shows the band from the gestation of the song from very early on and through completion, and it's interspersed with just scenes of I guess Vietnam and civil rights protests and so, things like that. I saw this movie at a midnight movie back in probably around 1979, 80. So it's been a long time. As I remember, the Rolling Stones parts were kind of fun to watch, all the protest stuff. It's kind of a hodgepodge of a movie, and it was pretty boring, as I remember, in the overall. But like I said, it's been 40 years since I've seen it. It would be interesting to see it again. Maybe it might still be boring. But it was interesting to sort of see the song take shape from idea to finished product in that movie. But Sympathy for the Devil gets a 10. We go next to song No Expectations, which sort of slows the pace down because it's a slower blues ballad. It's written by Mick and Keith, which surprised me because originally when I got this album, I think I was about 14 when I first got the album. I thought it was a cover of an old blues thing. It sounds like a Robert Johnson song, and that's what I'm saying is at this point, the band is not just kids covering blues songs, doing a pretty good job of it. They did early on, but it's more of a, they've had the experience, they've had the drug bust, they've had the watching Brian wither away, they've had all sorts of controversies and some hard living there in a few years, and so No Expectations actually comes off like a Muddy Waters or a Robert Johnson song, but it's to their credit that it's not, that it's written by Mick and Keith. Now, Mick and Keith can't go toe-to-toe with Waters or Johnson, obviously, but Mick does a good job here with the singing. He doesn't ham it up like he's wont to do a little bit too often. He plays it pretty straightforward. It's a sad, longing song of goodbye, the train motif, which so many blues songs have, that they use to great effect here. In retrospect, maybe this song can be seen as a farewell to Brian by the rest of the band. I don't think that's what they had in mind when they wrote it, but it does sort of work for that in retrospect there. No Expectations, nice blues ballad. It gets a 10. Now we go to sort of a country song. It's called Dear Doctor, third song on side one. This is Mick, and as he usually does anytime the band tackles a country song, he sort of takes on that southern hick, hee-haw, affected voice, and he does a little bit of that here. He doesn't ham it up too much like he does on some of the other country songs that come later on down in the catalog, but he does a little bit of it here. It's got some nice acoustic guitar by Keith. Brian plays harmonica. Pretty good job. He was always a good harmonica player, Brian was. And this just sounds like the band's goofing off, kind of sitting around drunk, singing, and having a little bit of a knees up and a bit of fun. It's a pretty good song. I'm going to give it a 7 on Dear Doctor. It's not as good as the first two songs. And then we go to another one, Parachute Woman, number 4, also written by Mick and Keith. And here's another, sounds like an old Chicago blues song. Again, as much as white guys from England can sound like old Chicago bluesmen. But it's a very basic and raw song, full of a lot of sexual innuendo, which the band would more and more delve into. But at this point, they still kept it in check pretty much. On the next few albums, they go a little overboard with that stuff sometimes, but here it's still pretty much in check. This is a nice, pretty little, just basic, hard, raw blues song, Parachute Woman is, and I'm going to give that a 8 for Parachute. Side 1 ends with a song called Jigsaw Puzzle. Now it's Keith's turn to play slide guitar. Brian plays mellotron on this. It's kind of fun. It's got a little bit of that crowded, wordy, descriptive, spewing out a lot of lyrics like Dylan was so famous for in the early 60s, and like Springsteen was on his first couple of albums. Just mentholated sandwich and all sorts of stuff. And it's fun when Mick describes each of the band members, the bass player and the guitar players are wrecked, and it's a fun song, Jigsaw, number 9. And speaking of slide guitar, which I forgot to mention, I believe, is Brian plays the slide to great effect on Going Back to No Expectations, and that's probably, arguably, even though he plays on most all of the songs on this album, that's probably his last truly significant or great contribution to the band. Brian was always good, one of the best musicians in the band when he took the time to be serious about it, and he brought in a lot of exotic flavors and a lot of different instrumentation and just deft touches to the songs that were sorely missing after he was gone. But here's just a basic blues slide guitar that sort of harkens back to Brian's original love of blues music when the band was first starting and before the Rolling Stones really even existed. And so I guess it's kind of fitting that his last big hurrah is a blues slide guitar that's so great on No Expectations. But jumping on a few songs up to side 2, we get to Street Fighting Man, which again, another great song, kind of a good rocker. I always thought when I was a kid that this was electric guitars. It's not. It's actually acoustic guitars and I read how this works, but I don't really understand it because I'm not a guitar player and I'm not a musician. But Keith played acoustic guitars into a tape recorder and turned up the sound or overloaded the tape recorder to where it fed back or looped back, or I like I said, I really don't understand how it works, but somehow that makes the acoustic guitars sound pretty much like electric guitars, and it works here. It works to a great effect. And so you've got that, and you've got the droney bits that we also thought were acoustic guitars, which is actually Brian playing sitar and some other Indian instruments. So yeah, Street Fighting Man, just a great opener to side 2, just as Sympathy is a great opener to side 1. I give it a 10. It's kind of funny because the same year we had Revolution by the Beatles, then we get Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones, and a lot of the people, the New Left, or the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, a lot of the people out there doing the demonstrations against Vietnam, civil rights, Nixon, things in France and all, sort of took the Beatles to task for not pushing hard enough with Revolution, saying, no to violence, more or less, instead of just storm the streets and take everything over. But here with the Rolling Stones, you sort of get the same thing, which is Mick singing that what can a poor boy do except for sing in a rock and roll band, so kind of what do you expect me to do? I can't save the world single-handedly or lead all this. So even though the Rolling Stones are seen as the tougher, the more street guerrilla band by many over the Beatles in some cases, but in the end it all kind of comes down to them saying the same thing. The only real difference is that the Beatles, or Lennon, seems to care, at least in Revolution, where in Street Fighting Man, Mick seems to be more the sitting back and observing it and disinterested, rather than weighing in on what he thinks should be done or what his opinion is, a little more detached. But they're both great songs, Revolution and Street Fighting Man. Street Fighting Man gets a 10. This was released as a single but didn't get a lot of airplay in the United States, so it only got to number 40, 48 or so on the chart. because a lot of American radio stations were not wanting to play this in the summer of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy assassinations and demonstrations and riots over all that stuff that, civil rights in Vietnam and all. Actually, the picture sleeve for Street Fighting Man is among the rarest of picture sleeves, certainly the rarest Rolling Stones picture sleeve, and if you can find one, there's only a few thought to be in existence, and I think they sell for $10,000 up if you can run across one. So if you have one in your attic or something, you might want to keep it in good shape. So the next song on side 2, Prodigal Son. This is old blues song written by Robert Wilkins that they play. It's a good song. I'm going to give it a 7. This kind of not that there's anything wrong with the song, it's fine, and they do a good delivery, good cover of it, but it does sort of slow the pace of the album down with yet another old timey blues song. But it's nice. I give it a 7. Things Pick Up Again, number 4. Stray Cat Blues, probably the most rock and roll song on the album. It could be. I mean, Sympathy's more of a dance beat song, and Stray Cat's right up there. But I mean, I'm sorry, Street Fighting Man is right up there. The Stray Cat, probably the most rock and roll song of them all. It gets a 10. A skeezy, sort of sleazy, filthy, nasty song about Mick's desire for 15-year-old girls. Probably wouldn't play so well nowadays. Probably didn't play all that well in 1968. But, they were on tour a lot in the early 60s and mid 60s, and I'm sure they jumped on their share of girls, and they probably didn't ask for IDs. So it is what it is. But it's a great rock and roll song, the sort of ickiness of it aside. But yeah, Stray Cat Blues gets a 10. Great rock and roll song. Next up is Factory Girl. This is sort of an old American folk song ballad. Could be seen as like an old English or Irish ballad too. It's about a guy just waiting outside the factory where his girlfriend works and waiting for her to get off, and they can go off and go home or take a walk or hold hands or whatever they want to do. It's funny because it's sort of a country folk song, but it's got Indian instrumentation on it. It's better country than Dear Doctor because Mick's a little more straightforward on this and not as hammy. But Factory Girl is a good one. It gets a 10. Album ends with Salt of the Earth, which is one of my favorite songs on the album and a great album closer. First of all, because Keith sings. I just noticed I was flipping y'all off there. I didn't mean to be doing that. Keith sings the first couple of verses. It's always like Keith's voice. He can't sing worth a damn, but it's always fun to hear him sing. And usually when he contributes a song to the album, which he will be doing from here on out for pretty much every album, I believe every album, almost every album, his songs are almost always a treat. He, of course, he writes the songs with Mick, all of them before this and up to this, but here he doesn't sing the whole song. He just sings the first verse or so, and then Mick comes in. And this is a great song. It's kind of a toast to the common man, but at the same time, you've got the bit about when I search the faceless crowd, they don't seem real to me, and so there's again that trademark Rolling Stone detachment and disinterest, as if Mick is just looking back, and Mick and Keith just looking back and observing but not really commenting, just saying here's these downtrodden people, but not really saying whether they think they should be helped or what should be done for them, if anything. But it works. It's got the a choir singing behind them, which is something that they will use to even greater effect on the next album, on the song You Can't Always Get What You Want. Salt of the Earth's a great song. It gets a 10. I love the pounding piano at the end. Nicky Hopkins, the great piano player, is all over this album, so he makes a lot of great contributions. So that is Beggar's Banquet, and it gets a 10. And out of the big four with the Rolling Stones, which again is this, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and and Exile on Main Street, the next 3 albums in a row. And I like all those albums, love all those albums, but I think this one is probably my favorite of the 4. And also, like I said, this is kind of their first grown-up album. This also seems like their first album proper, because even though, like I said, my favorite album is Between the Buttons, but that seems more a collection of songs. They sort of seem to move into make an album mode around Aftermath and Buttons and certainly Satanic Majesties. But this one seems like the first really where they were looking at it as a whole document, a whole artistic statement of an album, sort of the same way that the Beatles had started doing, probably from the time of Help or certainly Rubber Soul on, and the Who had been doing since probably Quick One and Sellout, and and the Kinks have been doing since Controversy or Face to Face. But this seems like the Rolling Stones' first real where they went in thinking about making an album instead of some hit singles with some songs to pad it out. Not that they didn't make great albums before that, but Beggar's Banquet, it's a 10. I will try not to take 3 months before I review Let It Bleed. Hope everyone's having a good weekend, and we will talk to you later. And I think that is all I have to say really on Beggar's Banquet. It's a good one. If you haven't heard this, give it a listen. It's one of the essential ones for sure.